Hello and welcome. I'm Susie. This is my podcast. This is not a well researched episode once again. So here's the deal, I have a whole list of things that I want to think about and talk about. And, I have a lot of loose thoughts about that I need to sort of round up and, define and put into some kind of comprehensible format. Not for you, for me, but also for you if you like it, which I like that some people like it. It's actually been very cool for me. So, this list of things, items, topics, whatever, I've had to sort of back burner that a little bit because my life has become quite busy. As everyone's life is quite busy. And this isn't a job, this is just a thing I do. So, I don't want to lose you, frankly. I know that there are a lot of really cool people listening to my random thoughts about the world, and my gratitude for this is just not expressible. So, I do want to keep delivering some content. And also, I do have some random thoughts that, crop up. So, this is one of those times. There's a lot going on, man. Let's get into it a little bit. Today, I want to talk about indictments. There's been a lot of buzz, in the wind. I'm thinking you know what I'm talking about without me even having to say so. But I'll go ahead and say so, which is former president of the United States has been indicted for criminal charges for the first time in the history of the United States. It is a big deal, but it's also kind of not. I want to just kind of, round up my thoughts on this and, put it out there in the universe in case anyone's interested. I love you. Thanks for listening. So here's what I want to talk about related to the recent indictment of the former president of the United States. I want to talk about that thing specifically, but the first thing I want to touch upon, and stay with me, is the idea of unresolved trauma. And it occurs to me, and I think I've said before, we as Americans specifically are not great about learning how to deal with trauma. We have a tendency to kind of push it down and move past it and grapple with it in all sorts of really unhealthy ways. And there have been a lot of changes in that in recent years, but it is part of how we function as a society and as a culture. And it shows up in literally every aspect of our society. And I think that the former president is a very good example of the culmination of how unresolved trauma in a societal framework or in a political framework can culminate into some very volatile things. So, kind of thinking about the idea of trauma is difficult for a lot of people because it's amorphous, right? You can't, you know, identifying trauma is hard, right? Like a lot of people don't even realize that they've been through it until they're sort of trained to identify the symptoms of it, if you will. It's helpful, I find, to think about mental illnesses as physical illnesses. So, in this case, let's think about trauma as a toothache. And a lot of people have like atavistic reactions to going to the dentist. So, many people will just kind of let it ride for a while. It's pain that you can live with. You can, take some Advil and get on with your life. It's not that bad. But after a while, it just gets worse. And there's, no amount of Advil or Tylenol is going to help, right? So maybe you start self-medicating to just kind of really, help elevate the pain management. It starts to disrupt your sleep because, you're awakened by pain or by, needing to take, more medication. it affects your body because your musculature is different in terms of how you are holding your pain. It affects your moods, obviously. Fatigue and pain itself can make people a little cranky, but the overall combination can really make people angry and irritable, and it can affect relationships. So if you're avoiding, kind of dealing with the baseline issue and you're just trying to, find ways to manage and crunch through, then the repercussions of that are often pretty toxic. And trauma is not different. Trauma and feelings of anger being repressed typically result in depression, in anxiety. We're seeing lots of increases in those sorts of conditions amongst people all over the world. And in American culture, we have this kind of idea of American exceptionalism that has a kind of specific demographic attached to it, e.g., middle class white people. And the feelings of a lot of those people right now are one of anger and frustration, feelings of betrayal, even, or victimization. They're worried about, gays coming after their kids and all sorts of just, feelings of either being constantly overlooked or constantly attacked. And that's trauma, right? That is a sensation of trauma that these people are going through. Whether you agree with its source or not, it remains a difficult thing to grapple with when you sort of are able to see that the basic truths that you have held for your life long maybe aren't as true as you thought, and in fact, maybe are harmful. Yikes. Like, that's a harsh realization for people, and I don't think that we should hold that lightly, nor do I think we should hold anger in our hearts for people who are struggling with that, because it's just a hard thing to do. I believe a lot of the anger relating to the former president derives from a lot of unresolved trauma. Our country is changing in ways that, you know, we've just not seen before. Equity, diversity, these are now core concepts in our everyday lives. There's resistance to it. I mean, I don't think any of us can deny that resistance, but it's, it's a wave that moves forward. It never goes back. So all that anger, it results in a lack of ability to accept the loss of an election. It feels like the end of the world, right? And so I think it's pretty natural that feelings of response to legal accountability for the former president, whose name you'll note, I don't like to say. I don't like him. Probably goes without saying, but I do not like that man. He's a bad, bad man. I didn't like him before he was elected as president. I didn't honestly, realistically think that could ever happen. I was shocked. I was shocked that he got the nomination, and I was double shocked when he got elected. And now I feel like nothing shocks me. So I don't know. Maybe there's an upside. I learned a valuable lesson there. And it was one that helped me really back up and look at the bigger cultural framework that allowed that to happen. And again, it's not a new one. All of this has happened before, and it will all happen again. So the idea of indictments is something that is, never reacted to with any, generally speaking, when you're talking about high-level offices and indictments, there's going to be a lot of visceral reaction to that because there's power involved. But this is not unprecedented. Anybody here who is a fan of Rachel Maddow and listens to her podcast is aware that Spiro Agnew, former vice president to Richard Milhous Nixon, was indicted on corruption charges, bribery and shit. He was a full ass scumbag, and he was in the Maryland state government before he rose to federal politics, and it went all the way back to that. And P.S. Spiro Agnew was not the only corrupt politician in Maryland, or every other state for that matter, but Maryland in particular has a deep and rich history of state level corruption. And so again, this isn't new. And the reaction, if you go backwards and look at the way that conservatives responded to Spiro Agnew's indictment, it is not dissimilar to what you see today, except that it was more disbelief and a lot less just outright anger at a specific, group of people. There was definitely the implication that the other group of people was, out to get him, but it was not characterized in the way that it is now. It's crystallized in a way now that it wasn't then. But again, point being, not new. So, the current indictment of the former president is one that everybody's whinging about. I'll get into that in a few minutes, but suffice to say, he went into an agreement with an adult film actress that, after he had allegedly extramarital affair with her, and they entered into an agreement where she was paid a sum of money not to speak about it. And this happened before the 2016 election, and it happened using allegedly campaign dollars, to do that, which is very illegal if you look at it from a campaign finance violation perspective. So I'll touch on that in a moment. But the indictment, this first indictment that has come out, I say that because it is likely that there will be subsequent indictments, including in the state of Georgia, and 2 federal charges, one on documents and one relating to the insurrection on January 6th. So, wow, that's a lot of criminal investigations. That in and of itself is obviously unprecedented. But this first one that came out, was the first one to occur, first of all. So it makes sense that it would be the first one, to arrive to indictment. Further, it is the easiest to actually prove, insofar as the lawyer who was in the midst of that arrangement and coordinated the payment to Stephanie Clifford, who was the actress in question, he actually went to jail for this very crime. So again, the precedent being Donald Trump, who was named in that original indictment as, it was unnamed as individual one, he's already been implicated in this crime. And so everybody's kind of complaining that it's like a bookkeeping error, that's a bookkeeping irregularity, right? And that therefore it doesn't rise to, the worthiness of indicting a former president, which fuck that. Yes, it does. Because again, I'll get into that. But what I really want to talk about with regard to the reaction to the indictment is the reaction that it is political persecution. Because I think that on this particular indictment, because it is a misdemeanor offense or, a kind of political federal offense, I mean, criminal nevertheless, but more like in the political lane, insofar as a campaign finance violation, it can more easily be characterized as an exercise of political persecution and therefore of an abuse of power. And I think that a lot of liberals will dismiss that out of hand and say, he committed a crime. He did it. And there's evidence to support that. And yeah, I'm down. I totally agree with that. But that's almost beside the point, right? Because you're not up against facts in this situation. You're up against the impression of a worldview. And here's what I mean by that. Let me take you back to the 1990s when William Jefferson Clinton was president of the United States, and a special prosecutor was appointed to investigate his involvement in a weird real estate scheme that he was only distantly related in. It was called Whitewater. They couldn't find anything in Whitewater that, directly implicated the president or his wife. And during the course of the investigation, a woman came up, and her name was Jennifer Flowers. She alleged that the then president had sexually assaulted her. And so the special prosecutor kind of didn't jump on that specific thing, but he started to chase it. And then a woman named Linda Tripp showed up with a bunch of tapes of her conversations with a young lady and a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky, who had been involved in a very inappropriate sexual relationship with the president. And the act itself isn't what the president was being chased for. The act was lying about it. And, from a liberal's point of view, those investigations gave the impression of politically motivated exercises, right? Because, it was all about his sort of personal, legal, but gross activities. But then he lied about it. And so it gave them a foothold into a way to pursue him on that. And it ultimately led to his impeachment, which, again, most liberals respond to as like outrageous, but for conservatives in government at that time, he lied to Congress, which is not cool. You're not allowed to lie to Congress, y'all. Just like, don't get it twisted. They're not effective, but they don't fuck around. All right, but back to the point. From the conservatives' point of view, these exercises were righteous and represented dispassionate application of the law. Moreover, they represented a moral corruption in the highest office in the land, which could not be tolerated. Sound familiar? Like, right now, that's how I feel about Donald Trump. He represents corruption that should never be in the highest land in the office. Honestly, I think there was an argument to be made for Bill Clinton not having the moral fabric to be president of the United States. That man is a predator, and shame on him, honestly. But, he wasn't a terrible president. Was he the best ever? No. But, he did some stuff, and he was able to work with Congress in a way that, really gave the United States a lot of momentum. And, we succeeded under his term. Just, saying that for whatever it's worth. He fucked up some too, like, no doubt. Crime bill. I'm looking at you. P.S. I'm not trying to make this about Clinton. I'm just saying that look at the coin, right? On the one side of the coin is the left saying, we're just following the law, right? We're just Alvin Bragg, the district attorney in New York, is just following the law. But conservatives, have a point in that liberals have been, on a scree. Like we liberals have been screaming about this man since he got the nomination because he's a legitimate criminal. I mean, I just don't think that's under dispute at this point, right? For most people, conservatives will, not want to talk about it because he's effective. But, and when I say effective, I mean effective at rallying the base, like getting votes, particularly in primaries. And he's excellent with fundraising, which, look, y'all, that's the number one thing. I don't think it can be understated, the value of the ability to raise money. And P.S., Donald Trump has raised, since his indictment last Friday was announced, it's not even unsealed. It's not unsealed. We don't even know what the charges are. He's raised $4 million in that time. All right. So he's a very effective fundraiser. And that is probably the number one thing that the GOP cares about right now. It has less to do with his moral fiber, has less to do with his policy effectiveness, has nothing whatsoever to do with his guilt or his innocence. He makes money, and money means winning. And that's all the GOP cares about, in my opinion, right now. That's not to say all conservative voters. I do mean the leadership within the GOP at the highest levels of government who are actually forming policy. Those people are, I don't want to say monsters, but kind of sociopaths that really just are not interested in the health and welfare of average Americans. So, hey, one more PS, actually. I just want to say that it's probably an overreaction on my part, but just to say it out loud, I don't like that the media keeps talking about Stephanie Clifford as, a porn star. It's not untrue. I get it. Stormy Daniels is her, nom de guerre, whatever you call it, stage name. I don't know. She's an adult entertainer, like just like a lot of other adult entertainers. There's nothing wrong or immoral in that, in my opinion. I know a lot of people will have feelings about that. That's okay. I totally respect that. But I just feel like slapping this like porn star label on it is a just another way of like making it a little more salacious and making her a little less credible in, having been smeared in the way that, she has been. Like it's totes fine that, people can just talk about her like this slut that, the president, got in bed with and then paid off. Like she's just some whore. Mm-mm. That's not what happened. Okay. He came calling, right? And then he didn't want her to tell because he had to run for office and he thought that maybe, you know, it would not look good for him. But had the Access Hollywood tape, the one where he talked about grabbing people by the pussy, had that come out prior to that, he probably wouldn't even have paid her off because he would have realized that he's like untouchable, apparently, as far as his base is concerned. He's gross. He's a bad, bad man, you guys. Blah. Okay, sorry. I've got to hold myself now. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about all this, kind of pundit whinging about the order of indictments. And I just think it's so, I don't know, feels like filler. It feels like there are times when, like, an event will occur and the news media is like all over it, right? They're just like, they send reporters and they're like standing around and no one knows nothing. And everybody stands around with coverage talking about all the things we don't know about and all the ways that we can speculate about what we might know any moment now. It's just noisy and it's a good way of getting people to ruminate, which is not a healthy exercise. For those of you who don't know, rumination is actually one of the symptoms of depression. When you start thinking about things in your head and you roll over it and roll over it and roll over it and you can't stop, that's rumination. It's not healthy. It doesn't get you anywhere. So here's what I want to say about the order of indictments, and I kind of touched upon this a little bit earlier, and the first of which is like no fucking doy that the hush money indictment is the first to roll out. It was the first to happen. I mean, this happened in 2015, 2016. So, and moreover, as I mentioned before, one of the people who was responsible for the perpetration of this crime already did time for it. So the evidence is tremendous. And when the current DA, Alvin Bragg, stepped in about a year ago, he was elected after the former DA, Cy Vance, had resigned. And he looked at that investigation that had been underway and that everybody had been saying, was moments away from indictment. And he said, nah, it's not ready. We're not ready to do this. We're not doing that. And two of the prosecutors on that team resigned as a result of it. And one of them just recently wrote a really kind of like damaging tell-all book. And by damaging, I just mean that, he, created some, he was angry. It was a very angry book, and clearly he feels like the right thing was not done as a result of this. But, hopefully he's seeing now that it was not a question of if, it was a question of when. I also have some questions about whether, how much heat DOJ may have been putting on Alvin Bragg. It was made pretty clear that under the Trump administration, there was some direct action taken by the State Department to try to interfere with investigations against the president at the time. So I don't, and again, when Alvin Bragg, took office, Trump wasn't president. But, again, one wonders, right? Just like government moves slow, and so the cultural changes also move slow, and one wonders how the culture may have attempted to interfere. I don't know. That's a reach. It's paranoid. It's black helicopter shit, but I'm just saying. So the three other investigations that are ongoing are in the state of Georgia, where the president allegedly attempted to interfere in the results of that election by calling the then Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. I think I got that right. Raffensperger. His name is strange. No offense, Brad. Sorry, my name is strange too. But they, had a phone call in which he basically said, please find me these votes so that, I can get the state. That one is wrapping up. We think it's pretty close. I'm in the council of elders. we like people, the people. It seems the reporting is that it's on its last what do you call it, leg? No, that sounds like it's dying. It's on the tail end, right? Like it's coming, like indictments impending is what was said, but impending in legal world could mean months. And then there's two federal investigations, one involving documents that the president stole, classified, the highly secured documents that the president stole and then lied about repeatedly. And then, of course, the investigation of the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, in which the president is, potentially accused of having incited. I mean, I accuse him of inciting it, but when I say that, I mean legally accused, because my accusations don't mean nothing. So that's a lot. Like I said, that's a lot of criminal activity the former president will be held to account for. The success of these cases are not foregone conclusions by any stretch of the imagination. So, one thing I want to say is for all of you who are disappointed that this first indictment is one related to something kind of seedy, let's remember that the way they took down Capone was on taxes. Like, it's an easy case to make. It's documentary, right? There's a lot of like actual documentary evidence that can, specifically prove that, he was responsible here, right? So, but here's the problem with that specific case, and I think is worth just keeping in the back of your mind for those of you who are like, ooh, they're going to get him, especially because of Cohen, right? Michael Cohen did time, the lawyer that was involved in the payment. So he did time for this charge and, pled guilty to it. And so, it seems, right, like fairly obvious that the president could also actually serve some time, conceivably. I mean, taking all the privilege stuff like out of it, right? Just like thinking about it, like base application of law. But one of the interesting things about it is a couple things. One, it's not likely to be the first to trial, even though it's the first to indictment. And a lot of that has to do with the way that the New York State courts work, the processes for motions, and a lot of like timing obstacles. Like, for example, on a misdemeanor, right? Like, which is really what the bookkeeping irregularity is meant to address. That one, wouldn't ordinarily go to trial, except that the president's lawyer has said on TV, at least, that there's no way in hell that he would ever accept a plea. So that's, short of dismissing it, which they're unlikely to do given the precedent of Michael Cohen actually having served time on it, right? It's not likely that they would dismiss it. And if they're not willing to accept a plea, then by default, it goes to trial, right? Which is kind of dumb. But the other problem is that, more importantly, on the campaign finance piece, which is a federal crime, that's a federal crime that has a 5-year statute of limitations, a federal crime that occurred in 2016, which makes the statute of limitation 2021, which means that it is not even, an indictable offense. Again, the indictment hasn't been unsealed. It's incredibly important to remember that we don't yet know what the president is being charged with. We will learn that in the coming week. And then the final point I want to make about this is basically, does it even matter? On this specific indictment, it freaking doesn't even matter. Like, he's already running, he's already announced, and frankly, there's an already north of 50% probability that he could win. And it's also important to note that there is no law anywhere, federally or at the state level, that prohibits a person under indictment from running for, being elected for, and serving office. And that is why the Senate not voting to convict the president on both of his impeachments is a fucking shame, because he should never have been allowed to run for elected office ever again. And they had the opportunity to stop it, and they did not take it. And now he can do what he wants. In fact, there is no federal law that prohibits a person in jail serving office. So just keep that in your nut, right? All of these things that have never happened before. I mean, that one's a little out there, but for crying out loud, did you ever expect to be where we are right now? Blah, blah, blah. Circling back to the idea of unresolved trauma, the president recently held a rally in Waco, Texas. And I think that that serves as a really good example of the president's method of tapping in to unresolved traumas and harnessing the anger and focusing it in on a specific target. He's very, very good at it. And the Waco venue really is an unresolved trauma issue. And it continues to be, I think, an ideologically divisive thing, because if you listen to liberal media, you will often hear this throwaway comment about the mass suicide of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, which is very much up for debate, because there were like dozens of children in there. These people didn't want to die, and the ATF used incendiary gas, a lot of it, into that compound, which was shoddily made and unsafe and had like all kinds of like code violations. So, a fire was probably to be expected. But to call it a mass suicide, to suggest that the Branch Davidians themselves set that fire, I find incredibly offensive. And I think that David Koresh was crazy. I mean, I think he was a legit psychopath, and that he was a cult leader, and that the people that were there were victims of his. And then they became victims of the federal government. And I don't like the way that people characterize that as some kind of impingement of like First Amendment rights, or an attack against freedom of religion. That's full bullshit. It really was an example of government overreach, in my opinion, during a period of time when the militarization of policing and law enforcement in general in the United States was on a big upward swing. Thank you, President Clinton, for that amazing crime bill. Sir, that was the result. Fucking Waco was the result. And of the result of Waco, the direct line was the Oklahoma City bombing. So unresolved trauma goes from point A to point B to point C, and there's no one better at finding it, channeling it, and pointing it than Donald John Trump. So I just think that it's really important to try to remember that the worldview of people who feel like this man is their savior for reasons I can't understand but are very real for them is that this is a politically motivated witch hunt, and any evidence that's derived can be mischaracterized as something like a bookkeeping irregularity, and it's going to fuzzy up the issue. But the issue is what I have talked about, and I think what most people talk about, is that it's just time for crimes to be punished. I don't even care how they're punished. I mean, I don't care if he serves time, to be honest. He's old. I don't think prison helps. So I really don't give a shit. But I would like to see his power stripped. Like, financially, and, if I'm honest, I think economic ruin would really diminish his voice. But again, he's a really good fundraiser. So that's going to be hard to achieve unless people, sort of start not to believe that, he's this, I don't know, messiah? I'm not sure what the attraction is, really, but I guess that's apparent. All right, it's time to stop talking now. Keep the faith. There is no going backwards. And indictments mean progress. So, let's not wring our hands. Let's just keep breathing through it. As we've discussed before, this is a long and slow process, and there's four of them at different levels of government. So it's going to be messy, it's going to be long, and it's going to be complicated by a lot of emotional reactions to things. So, for those of you who are worried and sad and feeling like, what's become of the world, this has all happened before and it will all happen again. And we're going to be just fine. And I really appreciate you listening. So thanks for coming back. And yeah, thanks.